preach this message for every preacher, first of all. He needs to learn how to preach. And Spurgeon was called the Prince of Preachers, but I don't think he owned that. He may have, but when we think of the Prince of Preachers, we're talking about the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the Prince of Preachers. I'd like to begin, first of all, by reading the Beatitudes down to verse 9, because on verse 9 is what we're looking at this morning for this message. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And again, I remind you that each one of these is like stair steps you're climbing. In some ways, we could say it's like that. If you're poor in spirit, you mourn over it, and of course, we all should be. And then, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Now, let me set it up very quickly again. I want to remind you of this. It's I tell you, it's what it does to your thinking, and I know you have no idea, but I've been rethinking over all the implications and tentacles of the thought of the kingdom. And it had just, for some reason, has been a great blessing to me personally, and I can't get into giving all my reasoning behind that, but it is a tremendous blessing. But I want to give you a little synopsis. What Jesus is talking about in all of this Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, 6, and 7, is the kingdom. Now, the kingdom, as we defined it, this is very important. It may seem strange to you to define it like this, but this is precisely what the kingdom is. The kingdom is the rule of Christ. It's not a realm over which he rules. Every Christian is in the kingdom, but the Christians are not the kingdom. Now, don't ever forget that. That's very important to remember. Christians are not the kingdom. Another very important thing is to understand the church is not the kingdom. The kingdom produces the church. Go back to the first definition of kingdom. The kingdom is always the rule of Christ. It's his ruling as king, as Lord. And so when he begets a new birth, he brings in a child of the kingdom. These blessed doesn't mean happy, as they've often been interpreted. Blessed means that if this characteristic is in your life, it's because God has blessed you with this characteristic. So if you are a peacemaker, and every believer is a peacemaker, then that's a blessing that God has made you to be. None of these qualities, excuse me, none of these qualities are natural to us. And I can't tell you how this distorts theology not to have this straight. One of the greatest distortions in theology, down through many centuries now, this started particularly in the Reformation. And I know you're not familiar with historical theology, but it's a very wonderful study that helps you understand how we come by these thoughts and these theses that simply do not hold water. And that is to make the church and the kingdom synonymous. There was a presupposition in the minds of the reformers why they did that. And they wanted to have the same because they wanted to have a connection to the Old Testament in a theocratic way more than in a totally differentiating way, that the church is something unique. The church is something that Christ himself builds. He is the one that brought it into being. Now, in the study and reading of scriptures, if you don't have that straight in your mind, you will constantly be confused. You'll not understand it. I will guarantee you this. If every time you see the word kingdom in the New Testament, with only a few exceptions, particularly when you get to the book of Revelation, then the people of God become the realm because of the nature of transition of things in the book of Revelation, but that's in the context that needs to be read and understood there. But all the rest of the places, it really means it has the dynamic equivalent of the rule of Christ or the rule of God in whatever sphere he is ruling in. And that sphere of rule differs from the world at large in which he rules, and he rules over everything, and he rules over everything right now. And what a blessing that is, just to have that in your theological cap, to understand that everything that's going on in the world today is under the rule of Christ. He is now seated on his throne. He is now ruling. There is nothing over which he does not rule, but he rules in the life of his people in a way that he does not rule in the world, which is obvious, because he brings the power of the kingdom into our lives by way of the gospel. He brings us into the new birth that most people don't understand today, because we back off from it, because we know the world it's been used. You're almost thought of as a buffoon if you believe in a new birth today. But anyway, the new birth brings us into the rule of Christ. And not only that, but if we listen to what Jesus said in John 3, we can't even see the kingdom, namely the rule of Christ, nor can we enter the kingdom, the rule of Christ, but by being born again. And then being born again is not something you do by faith. Faith is a result of the new birth. You see how your theology should run? That's why this thing is so messed up. And by the way, every one of these misnomers, and it's more than a misnomer, the practice of these truths, or lack of practice of them, leads to all kinds of practical outcome in evangelism and everything. This is why we have bow your head, close your eyes, repeat after me, and you'll enter the kingdom of God. That's pure nonsense. You need to be born again, but you're born again from above. You have nothing to do with the new birth. But you should repent, and you should believe, you see. But that product is a result of the new birth, namely the power of Christ. And it just turns everything upside down as to what not only we're hearing so much of today, but you see how deleterious it is upon the gospel itself and denying it. So let's now look at this blessed truth that Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." Now, if you read that, you automatically understand, well, I want to be a peacemaker because they're sons of God. Isn't it interesting that Jesus so clenched it at this point, in this really what is almost the last beatitude, that it's a clincher. The children of God are peacemakers. They're not troublemakers. The troublemaker is the devil. He is a #1 troublemaker. And he sows his seed in the human heart, and he sows it in many different ways to disturb people, to get them all upset, because sometimes their feelings get hurt a little bit, and they are disturbed about that, and so they react in different ways, and unfortunately they don't know what Christ is really discussing here. To be a peacemaker goes to the heart of being pure in heart, no pun intended. In other words, it goes to the heart. If you're pure in heart, you're a peacemaker. Does that sound reasonable? Just think about it. And I need not tell you that war rages on every level of human's existence today, because we are not peacemakers by nature. It's not only war between husband and wife, it's war between children and parents. There's war between educators and those who are being educated. There's war in body politic. There's war on the national level, where nations rise up against nations and fight. That's why we read James, because James isn't totally consistent with what we were talking about this morning. And when I talk about being a peacemaker, I'm not talking about being a pacifist. And the reason why I'm pausing on these points is because I don't want to rush over them, because many times people deduce from what you're saying certain things that don't collate with what you are saying. And one of the things I'm not saying, we're not pacifists. We fight, and we are at war. We put on the whole panoply of God that we may be able to stand an evil day, but we are peacemakers. And you'll see what the difference is, I hope, in a moment. But peace has been the cry of men throughout generations. We hear it all the time. Peace, peace. War in the heart of man, rather, war is in the heart of man, and it all began, of course, when man declared war on God. Mark mentioned in his Sunday school lessons, what's the problem? What's the problem with man? Well, man's at war with God. He doesn't want to admit that God has a right to everything about him. It's not a negotiable thing. God doesn't sit down and negotiate with men, well, you ought to love me, and you ought to do this. He imposed that on man because man was a rebel, to show them he was a rebel in order that he might come to his senses and say, I need help. But he doesn't. He continues as a rebel unless God intervenes and makes a change in his heart that turns that around. It's not an affliction to be a child of God, is it? Huh? How can you make that an affliction when it says blessed before each one of these things? It's a blessing. What a blessing to be a child of God. What would I be if God hadn't blessed me with salvation, blessed me with a Savior, give me the things he did, make the difference in my life? It's hard to say. I might be dead, I might be in a penitentiary, I might be who knows what. You see what we need to understand. And so when Paul said, I'm what I am by the grace of God, it takes in a greater focus than just the fact that it's this little narrow thing that we sometimes think of. We might say, well, when did that happen? Well, it happened when man decided he would stand against the one thing that gives peace, and that is the one thing that man doesn't want, and that's divine holiness. Man doesn't want anything with that. He wants to be respected as moral and upright and honest and all of that sometimes, and sometimes in a moral sense, just the moral sense, he's that, but not because of divine action. Even that could be said to be found to be the essence of sin, because oftentimes man is moral in what he does as far as being comparatively moral for his own advantage, because it advantages him to be respected and to be thought of moral. If you were going to work for a bank and you were going into the bank, the first thing you wanted them to make you think that at least you're honest, right? I went down to the bank the other day. My wife had a garage sale, and I had just a big old pile of change, and I didn't have stuff to put it in, so I said, I'm sorry, and I brought it in one of those plastic bags, and I dumped it out on the counter. Poor guy had to count all, and I had all kinds of pennies and all that stuff, and I laid it out there, and I said, I'm sorry. I said, but I really didn't want to do it myself. And he counts them all out, and he gave me 30 cents back. So I thought, well, I told him, I said, well, I could be wrong. And he decided to go over it again. I'd counted it 2 or 3 times before I took it to the bank, so I thought I was right. And I don't know, he must have been a beginner, because he's counting the pennies one at a time. I counted them at least 2 at a time, 2, 4, 6. And I don't know how Sam, he does this all the time, but that's the way I count them. And then if I want to keep it separate, because my mind is so systematic, if you get it out of any kind of a systematic approach, I'm lost. And so I put them in piles of 10, so I can go back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, And so I've just kind of worked. That's the way my poor brain works. He says, I need that money back, because it was right. But you see, he has to be an honest man, because if he messes up, he's not only got the wrath of the customer, but he'll probably get fired, because you don't work in a bank and make too many mistakes and get by with it. You see, so man has a motive for being honest, and many times it's selfish, but the essence of sin is selfishness. Did you realize that? These things tie themselves together, and so when we look at the depth of what Christ is teaching here about what he does for our lives and everything else, None of these Beatitudes are innate to you or me or any other human being. That's not what he's talking about. These are only found in children of the kingdom. Only found in children of the kingdom. Nobody else. That's a very important thing to understand. War is in the heart of man before it ever was manifest itself in the overt acts of war. It's in him. The world of men is such that they cannot make peace. But now think of this. This is a very important philosophical point, but it's an important one. Men cannot make peace without compromising. And the moment you compromise, you have to compromise something. Right? And, they say in marriage, the marriage counselor, gets two people together and at loggerheads, a husband and wife, and said, now one of you is going to have to give in. And guess who? Everybody wants to say, oh, I'll do it. Baloney. I want my way. Right? And so what I'm saying is that compromise doesn't resolve the issue. So underpinning every compromise that says for righteousness' sake, and I want to do this, there's a concession to righteousness. You realize that? Now listen, hear me very carefully. I'm going to work this out. This is not an average message. I'm not boosting my own message. I'm just telling you, this is what the Lord is saying, and I think I understand what he's saying. The only possible way to achieve what he's talking about here, the peacemaker, is that we got to know him who is the Prince of Peace. And he is the only one that can achieve it. Now, you think about that for a while. In fact, I want you to think about it for the rest of your life. It's only possible to have true peace and righteousness by Jesus Christ. It's not possible to have it any other way. The world of man is such that they cannot make peace, but in a compromised peace, and true peace can only come when the issue of sin is dealt with according to God's prescription. And that demands righteousness, not appeasement. I do not make this up, but rather find it clear in Scripture when I talk about these things. James 4, verse 1. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this? Your passions war within you. In other words, it's what you desire. And what we desire crosses the line. It's not righteous. If you bring every desire into check, where do we bring it into check with? So I can please you or I can please somebody else? I need to do that, and it's acceptable to do that. But the one thing that I do, if I bring anything into check, is to please him. Blessed are those who what? Hunger and thirst after what? Righteousness. You see how they go together? You can't compromise these things. They stand and fall. They build the whole picture and the whole man. And these are children of the kingdom. Nobody else is. Us stop kidding ourselves. Us stop kidding ourselves. I went to the wall of that church and I walked over and I looked at all these people who were dead. They were in bronze on the wall. And the first thought to me, how many of those people and what kingdom are they in and where do they now dwell beyond this life? Because you sit in a church pew does not make you a child of the kingdom. And it doesn't make you one because your name is etched in bronze on a church house wall. It's only if you're written in the Lamb's Book of Life. It's amazing stuff, isn't it? Therefore, a peacemaker is not a self-made person. God is the only one that can and does make peace everywhere, but in particular the heart of his people. And there will be peace in this world. There will be peace. Because he rules over everything, right? We got a king that's going to win. I don't know how you think about these things, but that's a good way to think about it, isn't it? I always want to be on the right side of things, don't you? I want to try to be on the winning side at least. I want to try to pick, I don't try to pick the losing side. I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think that's too rational either. If you want to be on the winning side, you got to be in the right standing with the King. So the first point in this message is this, beyond my introduction. The only place that peace can truly be achieved is by God making peace. Cannot be achieved any other way. And all the discussion of peace among nations and everything else, now listen to me carefully, this is relevant. If I had you in college and I was teaching you, if you didn't understand this, I'd flunk you. You'd fail. Because all the things you can read historically and look in the rearview mirror historically, you'll never find peace until the Prince of Peace comes. It's not achievable. It will never happen. I want peace, don't you? I wish nations didn't fight each other. I wish we didn't have men and women all over the world fighting to protect whatever freedom we have and doing what they're doing. And sadly say they pay an awful price. It can only be achieved by the rule of Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. Peace, therefore, can only be achieved by the gospel itself. For instance, in Isaiah 9, verse 6, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor." Boy, I love this. I tell you, I'd love to hear it sing. What a great achievement to hear that sang in that way. Mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Prince of Peace. If therefore is not a negotiated peace at all, God doesn't negotiate peace. God did not sit down with a second party and negotiate peace, for if it can only be achieved by fully venting the wrath of God on his enemies. Somebody says, well, that'll achieve peace. It sure will. If I have a lion come out of the forest to me and I had my .6 and I put a bullet right between his eyes, there's going to be peace. Right? He's not going to growl anymore. That's exactly what God's going to do. What do you think it means to trample the winepress of his wrath? What do we see him in Revelation with his garments completely splattered with blood? And they're either going to be splattered with the blood that comes through the winepress of his wrath, or we're going to look at Calvary and see that blood and say, there's peace. So it's not peace at any price, people. It's peace at a great price, and God paid it. If therefore it's not negotiated peace, peace therefore cannot be achieved can only be achieved in the cross of Christ. Man's peace, you know what man's peace is? It's a ceasefire. Can you see a husband and wife going at it and say, ceasefire? That means I'll still take my stubborn way and you take your stubborn way and we'll keep on fussing. Just a ceasefire. That's all man can achieve. He can't achieve peace because he cannot deal with the root and fundamental issue of why war happens. For instance, here's one of the great passages in all the Bible. Will you please take note to it? Colossians 1, verses 19 through 23. Listen to these words, because here is the whole basis of peace in the world. And Jesus said, Paul said, for in him all the fullness of Godhead was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself, notice, all things. And by the way, that is the New Testament. If you want theology, folks, listen to me now. You may not understand it, but mark this down. Never forget it. This is the way that we define the word atonement in the New Testament. It is the word reconciliation, not atonement. It's not a covering. It means that God has made satisfaction through the death of Jesus Christ. He has punished sin, and he's reconciled all things himself only in the terms of the cross. Not on any other terms, in the terms of the cross. He's reconciled all things to himself, whether on earth or heaven, making peace, notice, by the blood of the cross. And you who once were alienated, notice, and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless approach before him, if indeed you continue in faith. And hence the perseverance, stable and steadfast, shifting not from the hope of the gospel that is heard, and which proclaimed to all this creation in heaven, in which I, Paul, became a minister. The gospel is the gospel of peace. As ironic as it might sound, the Christian soldier has the gospel of peace as a part of his armor to fight. Isn't that amazing? Sounds like an oxymoron. Ephesians 6:14 through 15, stand therefore having on the belt of truth and put on the breastplate of righteousness. And by the way, you can't put those two things on and say, well, you have peace at any price. The believer doesn't do that. You don't even do this in the church. You look for righteousness. The solution when you have a problem is righteousness. And as your feet shod with her, I'm reading from the old King James Version while I'm reading from the ESV. Do you ever do that? As shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness and giving the gospel of peace. That's what brings it about. To understand this, we only understand that Christ puts on the whole armor of God in order to bring the message of peace into the camp of the enemy. He himself, by what he did. Second, God does not achieve peace by compromising himself in any way. For instance, God achieves peace in righteousness. It's the only way it can be achieved. There is, in other words, a price for peace. God does not make peace through appeasement. The Lord doesn't try to appease man. He doesn't try to appease anything. The devil wanted Christ to compromise in order that there might be peace between his kingdom and his kingdom. And all he says, get thee behind me, Satan. The proto-evangel says this, he'll bruise your head. You'll bruise his heel, but he'll bruise your head. Why? Because he's going to step on your head. He's going to crush your head. But God does not call us to peace by compromising purity or holiness of life. If this were not, the pure in heart would not be pure in heart. They couldn't be trusted for peace if it would compromise. The church is an achievement of the cross to create a body of peacemakers. That's what the church is for. I really do think that if you not only study the whole New Testament, you look down through history and your own experience to a great extent, it's not that Christians can't act ugly, because they can. But boy, Christians who act ugly need to be repentant. Huh? Don't they? But I find people that just think they can come into a church and just run right over it and do all kinds of things and then walk away. I want to suggest to you that a good dose of the new birth might be a help to them. I really mean that. Listen to Ephesians 2, verses 15 through 16. By abolishing the law, commandments, and ordinance that might be created, that he might create in himself, notice, one new man in place of the two, so making peace. And he's talking about Jews and Gentiles. But the duplicitous that's in us, listen to me carefully, the duplicitous is in us, is joined as one person in Jesus Christ. If we're schizophrenic, pardon the use of bad language, but if we're schizophrenic about our salvation, it's because we're not focused on Jesus Christ. We're focusing on our own selfish interests instead of on his interest. We haven't died to our interests. Somebody says, well, somebody hurt my feelings. I get hurt all the time. But if I went out to defend myself every time I got hurt, where would I be? It's the world we live in, isn't it? I don't say that's acceptable. But what I'm saying is that we don't live in a world where always we can have every little thing justified for our actions of being anything other than a peacemaker. And this is what he's saying. So making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. In other words, what really kills the hostility? I can give the application of the cross for your life, and here it is. It's a simple thing. If I had a dead person laying up here, I'm glad I don't. I'm glad it's not you, okay? If I had a dead person up here, now, I don't want to sound gross, but I might have a bowling ball and drop it on him. It won't hurt him. Right? If you're dead in the cross of Christ, can anybody hurt your feelings? Can they? Well, no. They can't hurt a dead man. But the problem of it is we're really alive. And we want to defend ourselves. That's why Jesus was teaching us in the Sermon on the Mount later on. Turn the cheek, the other cheek. Why don't we want to turn the cheek? Why do we want to, when he turns his cheek, slap him? Because we're not dead. The flesh is still there. It needs to be crucified. And in practical terms, though, you start with the objective fact that you have died in Christ and the whole world is crucified unto you. And isn't that what Paul said? The world is crucified unto me. And he said, not only that, I'm crucified unto the world. In other words, the world says to Paul, you stink. Paul says, I'm sure glad. I'm sure glad you don't like it. That's a good sign when the world doesn't love you. In fact, in the next couple of verses, we're going to find out that's the best sign that you're a child of God you can be if the world hates you for my name's sake. Can you see how this goes together? It's hand in glove. The greatest teacher in all the world taught this. And he knew what he was talking about. Our quest for peace, not our achievement of peace, cannot be accomplished without one thing: personal holiness. Listen to Hebrews 12, verses 14 and 15. Strive for peace with everyone. Isn't that something? Is that in concert with the Beatitude? Oh, yeah. And notice, and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And I wrote in quotes after that, the pure in heart are the peacemakers. That's exactly the way they dovetail together. Verse 15, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many are defiled. In other words, it's the grace of God that we need to keep from being vindictive, retaliatory, carrying a grudge, vengeful. All of those things takes the grace of God. And when he gets our life and our heart straightened out, what does it matter? We don't retaliate, we show love. We do the opposite. Third, quickly, peace is maintained by not compromising the truth. We compromise the truth when truth does not sanctify the heart of those who are as per Jesus' intercession. It's not the fault of Jesus' intercession that we do not carry out his will. Purity of doctrine and purity of conduct should be put together. That's exactly why Christ prayed in John 17:17, sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. Purity of doctrine and purity of conduct go together. They're not separate entities. But a lot of people don't see the connection. Well, my doctrine's pure, but how about your life? If your doctrine's pure, your life ought to be pure. It's the only way it can be. Can't be any way else. And that's what Christ was teaching. In 1 Peter 3, verses 10 through 11, for whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit, and let him turn away from every evil and do good, and let him seek peace and pursue it. That is if you want life. That's Peter's words, not even James. Let's see, Peter, James, John, Jesus. Isn't it amazing they all agree? Of course, I'm being facetious. But I'm doing so for the hopes that you'll get the point that I'm getting strong in my own life. And believe me, these things speak to me. They sure do. They convict me. So peace is not achieved at any price. Jesus prayed for oneness of his people. But we have no mandate from Christ to seek unity without purity. None whatsoever. And I've heard that oftentimes, that we seek unity without purity. You don't do that. You seek unity and purity together. Peace is never achieved in the gospel without the cost of discipleship. The true disciple learns early on that he or she must relinquish all personal rights for what is right, as he will, of course, add to our lives everything that is needed in order that we might do the right. It is his will that must be done. To try and to take the shortcut will not work. Closing verse. I've got another point too, and I'm tempted to prove it, but then I'd be lying. This message is such a whole. I'm saying that, folks, not because I'm preaching it. I hope you realize that. Jeremiah 8, verse 11, they have healed the wound of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there's no peace. It is the devil who's the troublemaker. Peace in this world will never be achieved until the full effect of Jesus' reconciling death is accomplished in the world. Never will. We can pray for peace. We can pray for our nation. We can pray for one another. But the way it's accomplished is in the kingdom, not any other way. It won't be accomplished any other way. When Christ comes back to this world, and he's coming, isn't that good news? How many of you know when he's coming? Only John Hagee knows. Did you know that? Oh, I know. There's a few others you could name. That is as spurious as, when you think about it, how ridiculous that people follow a man who says something like that. And they do. The other day, I do this, and I know I shouldn't do it. I turned over for a little bit of amusement. If I wanted to laugh, and this guy was telling how he was able to get a revelation from God that you had to stick your finger in your ears. And if you just stick your finger in your ears and ask the Lord, then it shuts out everything else. And the first thing I thought of, well, you dumbbell, what's going on inside your heart? It's not what goes into the body, Jesus said, it defiles the man. It's what comes from the inside. And you are an evil one, and you're a devil, and the people ought to know who you are. And these two birds sitting there with their fingers in their ears playing. And they kept saying this all along. Now, we're not trying to get money. And they were lying through their teeth. They were trying to credential themselves in the eyes and ears of a bunch of naive people that don't know their left hand from their right hand because they haven't got somebody faithfully preaching this book to them so they know the difference. They're charlatans, and they ought to be exposed. I tell you, folks, I do less. If you want to see me angry, you get me against the false prophet. I'm ready for war when I face one of those boogers. They're rotten people. I have no use for a false prophet. Don't tell me, come up to me and ask me to be nice. I'm not going to be nice with a false prophet. I'm going to have on the whole armor of God, and I'm going to take the sword and stab him. This book right here. You say, well, you just preached on a peacemaker. When I get through with him, it'll be peace. Right? When Christ gets through with him, there will be peace. You see, we misunderstand these things. People, and I could just, the reason why I said that, what I said, is because maybe I think it'll happen here, but I thought, well, there'll be somebody come up. Yeah, you believe in being a peacemaker. You're just going to stab somebody. Well, I'm not speaking, I'm speaking metaphorically, but I'm speaking in reality when we talk about the word. These guys are awful. And I can't imagine people following these kind of people. What they do by the thousands and tens of thousands, if not millions. It's absurd. No wonder there's deception. Oh, dear people, I hope we are peacemakers. I really do. Not peace at any price, but peace that comes because we have known what it is by God shedding abroad in our hearts the peace that makes the difference. Let's pray.